Hello and welcome back to the second video lecture for week 11 on interpersonal communications. And here we're going to focus on a particular kind of communication which has become more and more prevalent over the last few years, which is social media. And that is both using the internet or intranet and social media, whether it's Facebook, Twitter, or so on. And we have political announcements that are being broadcasted on Twitter now, so it's kind of worth looking at. Okay, so we know that verbal and written communications take many different forms. We've talked about a variety of them. Face-to-face communication, speaking to someone on the telephone, cell conversations, Zoom meetings, right? Virtual meetings, Skype, email, blogs, the works. Twitter, Facebook, all kinds of them. So we have a whole range of different outlets when we wish to use social media to communicate with a single other person or a large group of people, potential consumers, whoever it happens to be. So that is kind of where we're at today. So we have a variety of different forms under which we can sort of place all of them as social media. And as a result of it, we can also see that technology, right, which is what drives social media, is also very pervasive. And both instructors and students are expected to learn how to navigate through this, learn how to use Zoom quickly, learn to use FOL, for example. All these things are part of the, at this point, it would be considered almost soft skills, right? When you get into, Excel spreadsheets, specific software for rendering 3D images and so on, that's a bit more specific. But the things we're talking about here are things that are now considered soft skills. How to write an email, how to run a blog, a wiki entry, how to use Twitter and Facebook. All that stuff is important in terms of being able to communicate in today's world, in the 21st century. And that's kind of what I want to look at. And what's happened, though, is social media has changed our sense of time when it comes to sending and receiving messages. Because what's happened is, because social media is so quick, we expect a quick response. When we, when the pressure's on us to come up with a quick response, we tend to make mistakes. We tend to not think about our message as carefully as if it were a written response, written on a piece of paper, right, or typed out. So if we are going to use social media correctly, we certainly can celebrate its rapidity, right, the fact that it's rapid communication technology. But we also have to make sure that we still, make sure our message is correct, that it's current, that the degree of language is such that it is a business communication. So even though it's quick, we need to also be mindful of perhaps the response time should be considered as equally as the sending time. What that means is the person that is communicating with you may have spent 20 minutes, half an hour, a whole day shaping and formulating this perfect email. Because why? Because they were thinking about you, especially if it's bad news. So we don't know how long the person that has sent you the message spent on shaping and forming their communication. So just because social media is fast doesn't mean the response has to be fast, because that's when we make mistakes. So we wish to be current and correct and thoughtful. So take the time to formulate a proper response. One of the other aspects too of social media is the degree of bullying, the fact that people can be bullied, whether it's cell phones, on Twitter and Facebook and so on. This is something that happens in the business world and most certainly happens in the private world with communications back and forth. And nothing is worse than starting a thread with someone that you had no intentions of offending in some way, and you wrote out your message in a respectful and honest kind of way, and guess what? The person misunderstands it, misreads it, and the next thing you know, you're off in some Twitter war with somebody, or on Facebook, some message that goes on and on. I hate those. So whenever I formulate a response to something, I stop and think. Even if it's one sentence, I look at it, and the first thing I think about is, could someone be offended by these 5 words? this one sentence. So if they could be, unless that's your intent, rethink it and either edit it or delete it. Think. There should be a button on all those social media platforms. Are you sure? Yes, no. Are you sure that you're sure? Yes, no. Because if people at least had a chance to jump through a couple more hoops before the message got out, we might have a lot less toxicity in that social environment. So, regardless of where the message is being sent to from, it can be the social intranet, right, within the corporation, or what's called the extranet, or as we know it as the internet. So these are web pages for customers, potential or otherwise, or long-standing suppliers and so on, where people just place information. They post information on their product. But the intranet or the internet, in either capacity, we need to be mindful of the things that we're going to talk about just now. Okay, so internet connections. Now, I yellowed this out because this is literally the world we've been in for the last 18 months. Internet connections allow employees or students to work at home rather than commute to a central office or school, enhance access for people with disabilities, which is very true, and communicate across oceans and time zones. I know that some of you are at home. You're probably saving yourself a lot of money by staying home with your parents, or you're staying, you may be living somewhere else other than London, Ontario. That's perfectly fine. That's where social media and the internet is this fantastic tool, this revolutionary tool that we literally did not have 25 years ago. And it's upgraded very slowly, but certainly with fiber optics, high-speed connections, it is incredible what we have been able to do. But just because we can do things quickly doesn't mean we have to do things rudely or incorrectly. If people just want to troll, that's fine. But trolling in a business environment, not a good idea. So, technology and technological changes means that we have to be always up to date in terms of software updates, in terms of netiquette, social etiquette, how to communicate with one another, because there's a lot of things that we can do that might end up breaking the trust that we have with our potential consumers or customers, long-term customers, where that might even hurt more. But we want to make sure that we keep an active record of the things that we do, because if I haven't mentioned it before, I'm going to mention it now, that we're in a climate now where court cases have been fought and lost or won because of things like emails, internal emails. So when you're writing an internal email, just because one or two other people may be reading it, think of it as potentially something that could end up in court and being read out loud. And so if that's the case, concision and clarity are absolutely important. You need to make sure that the person understands the message that you're conveying to them in the best way possible. So I'm not saying every single email, something like, hey, what are you doing after work today? Probably not important, but boss, we have a problem in the laboratory. Our equipment is failing and we are not measuring things correctly. That's pretty important. And I say that because this was an email that generated a lawsuit against Volkswagen several years ago that they ended up losing because someone paid attention to the emissions control testing equipment in the laboratories, and cars were being sent out having been measured at a certain emission ratio, but in fact it was completely wrong. And not only was that incorrect in terms of advertising, but it also did not follow suit in terms of government sanctions, in terms of emissions with pollutants. So the first person that sent that email, the first thing you want to look at is who was it sent to and by whom. If this was simply an underling working in a laboratory that, whose job it was to work these things, sees that there's an error, and the person that they wrote to, if they ignored it, okay, there's going to be some problems. So be mindful of who you send that information to and always make sure that it's clear. Okay, so social media is a way in which we communicate with one another. The problem is it is useful for us to communicate to one another, but guess what? Everybody can play on social media. It's a platform for everyone. And so if that's the case, if you have wronged someone, be mindful that person can turn around and go on social media, Twitter, Facebook, whatever, and start, whining and bitching about your company. And there's nothing you can do. You can't sue them for defamation. You can't sue them for libel. You can't sue them for slander, because they're telling the truth. They were wronged by you, and if you are aware of social media and its power, you're going to make sure that person doesn't even have the opportunity to go and complain about your company by dealing with it internally. And that doesn't mean shut them down. It means deal with the problem, because all of a sudden they'll go back on social media, all right, but they're going to be praising you. That is free advertising, and it is the best advertising, because that person did not even have to go on there to say anything. But because you dealt with them correctly, adequately, and smartly, they're pleased. They're a happy customer, and you dealt with their problem. Of course they're going to tell people about it. Some people don't. They don't care. But some people are so happy that things went their way, they're going to tell people. So, if that's the case, and we are living in what's called the information age, we need to be mindful of these kinds of things. So, time and knowledge management will depend on identifying which messages are important. Some people will just troll and whine, but other messages may really be detrimental to your company. Deal with those and consider them as high priority. And 2, understand what company personal information to disclose or not. Now that is both within the company and from one company to another, or from the corporation to the media or out in public. So identify and decide which messages are more important than others. In other words, prioritize those messages. And 2, understand how much you need to state about the company's position in order to put yourself in the best light possible, right? And the most persuasive light possible. Don't lie to people. Don't hand out misinformation, or even worse, disinformation. And there are distinctions. But make sure that the information you present is relevant and useful for your case. Okay, if you are ever in a position like this, now this is perhaps less to do with direct schoolwork, but it most certainly has to do with interacting with friends, with relatives, family members, but in this particular case, in a business environment. So if you have to formulate a message, a communication to someone, think of these 5 questions. And if you can answer them correctly, you're less likely, or you're going to minimize the damage you cause to yourself, your company, or to its public image. And the 5 questions are pretty simple. Okay, what is at stake? Right? What is not stake, but stake? Let's correct that. There we go. What is at stake, and to whom? So, what is at stake is perhaps some misunderstanding that a customer may have with you, and that's the person you need to deal with. But they're on social media, chirping away about how bad you are. So, if that's the case, you want to fix that. Secondly, should I send a message? Well, it depends. If the person is kind of talking after the fact and you've resolved it in some particular way, do I need to, call attention to it and reciprocate with yet another message? So, should I send a message in the first place? If this is something that's done internally and it is a series of emails back and forth and not on social media in terms of, say, Twitter and Facebook, it would be, for example, a private message rather than a public. Should you send a message, yes or no? What channels should I use? If this is a private correspondence, keep it private. You don't need to make a public message out of it. What should I say? This is when you want to sit down and consider the good news versus bad news email or memo or whatever message this is. Is it good news or bad news? What should I say? What should I leave out? How much does this person need to know? And then finally, how should I say it? Should I consider it to be a bad news message? And if it is, remember, right, you want to soften the blow by setting it up so that it's maybe halfway through the message and immediately move into something positive, some positive goodwill that will lessen the impact of the message as being something bad. So all those things are important, and as you work through and using social media as the useful tool that it is, you're less likely to harm your public image, the company's image, your own, and you will likely hang on to that long-term or long-time customer. So what you're really doing is managing the knowledge that's being dispersed out through public media. So effective knowledge management requires individuals and organizations to choose which technology is best for a particular audience, purpose, or situation. So what that means is, if it is something that is going to be legally binding, a personal message, on your phone, maybe not as valid or as having as much impact as an actual written letter. Now, it doesn't have to be handwritten, but a written letter, an actual letter that's sent through the mail, and say, I have CC'd the following people, in other words, carbon copy the following people. So there are several copies of this letter that are out. So if you lose it, other people are aware. So this correspondence is legally binding. It could have to do with a warranty that is lapsed. It could anything that is a legal matter. Always make copies. Store those copies so they are available, whether they are hard copy or email, but store them somewhere because you may need them, because it is a legal matter. So whatever the technology is that you use, a lot of it will have to do with the particular task that communication has to fulfill. If it is to remind people of a legal mandate, then write a letter. If it's to remind them, hey, we've got a sale on, 30% off on something, then clearly an email or just a general post is really more than enough. So the way in which communication technology works, it affects the way people interpret messages. A personal message, internal memo, seems to carry less weight than a CC'd written letter that arrives to you in a letterbox, right, through the post. So no matter what though, regardless, you want to make sure that those messages, good news, bad news, whatever they are well designed, they are error-free, they are persuasive, they are mindful of the audience. So whether it's an email, a written text, internal memo or private memo, whatever that is, you still have taken the time to write a proper response. So again, it doesn't really matter the form in which it takes or the channel in which it is communicated. You wish to make sure that that message is still honest, concise, persuasive, and adequate to the message that you are responding to. So if you are preparing for a website, a blog, any kind of social media, remind yourself too that the average person is not going to scroll through the entire, text. PDFs are great, but a PDF of a book, which is 340 pages, that's a lot. So I tend to look at a PDF, especially of a full book. I'll go to the index, I'll go through the table of contents. I will also use a little, the magnifier, like the finder, so I can use the search function of a PDF, much like a Word document. Those things are super helpful because it allows you to identify exactly, a passage that you're looking for. So those are some of the positive traits of a PDF or document. But some of the negative ones are that it takes less time. It's a little less, it's more clunky because you can only ever see roughly 25% of that text on a screen. And some people are using exclusively telephones. So the message is smaller little chunks, even more, even less so than before. So there's the book where you see the top of the page, the bottom of the page, you can see how much you've got left to read, all these kinds of things, all these kind of added bonuses. Now imagine reading that same PDF on a telephone. So you're reading slower, you're reading less at a time, you have to scroll constantly to get through it, and all of those secondary things are going to really kind of slow you down and cause more fatigue, mental fatigue, eye fatigue. So remember that when you're sending a message through the internet, and it is something you read either on a laptop or a full-size screen or a telephone, keep the way in which the message is being read in mind. Still, all messages should be informative and persuasive. That is important. So think of that audience all the time. Think of the audience, whether it's an irate customer, a happy, a long-standing customer, whoever it is. You want to make sure that that message is positive, it's good news, and if it is bad news, make sure that it is de-emphasizing the negative aspects of that message until at least the middle of You want to have the buffer first, and then the negative aspect in the center, and then immediately follow it with positive goodwill to the best of your abilities. So that is very important. So informative and persuasive messages are going to build credibility between yourself and the reader. So the writer of the message and the reader of the message will feel that they've been dealt with honestly. So you wish to always build credibility by just taking the time to write a good communication. You can also enhance the reputation of the writer's organization, right? The company you work for. So whatever it is that you're doing, that writer's organization will be reflected in the quality of your writing. You can also cement, right, solidify that relationship between the writer and the reader by having the reader notice that you are taking the time to formulate your response correctly, adequately, persuasively, and with good intentions. And you also ensure that the message doesn't require more messages, more emails, because they're unclear, they're illogical, they're irrational, you're not sure, the reader isn't sure what you're trying to say. Like, am I supposed to do something, change my mind, or whatever? So anytime you have a message, informative and persuasive, these are really the two key points that you wish to think about, because you want to build credibility, enhance reputation, cement that good business relationship with the other person, and make sure that it doesn't require even more messaging for it to get through. Okay, so if that's the case, then you want your message to be valid, reliable, and current. All of these things really have to do with the messaging. And then furthermore, if you're using social media in order to go and research, keywords are also important, because your online database is one place where you're going to find those keywords as you're trying to formulate that message. Keywords, though, are probably more important for just pure research, right? So if you are doing research for a paper, such as you're doing right now, keywords are important. Like, these are descriptors that kind of summarize as briefly as possible the overall tone of the paper you're trying to write, the report you're putting together. So computer searches are going to be made that much easier by having the keywords be as concise as possible. And then finally, you want to use the following criteria to decide whether a website, once you've decided this is going to be what I want to use, make sure that that website is reliable enough to use for your research project. And this is, again, directly related to what you're doing right now. So think of the authors, right? What person or organization is sponsoring this site? What credentials do the authors have? Are these people that are simply just, thinkers, free thinkers? They may not have any affiliation with a school, a business, or an organization, scientific society. Who are the authors, right? Because once you can identify that, that's going to tell you something about who they are and perhaps how valid the message is. If there are no authors, ask yourself, why is that the case? Now, if you're at Stats Canada, you're likely not going to find authors, or if it's a government-funded source, you may not find authors. So there may be a reason for it. But if it is not, .org, for example, or .edu, and there are no authors, that may explain it. If it's a .com site, maybe there's a reason why there are no authors. So be mindful of that. Is that site objective? Does it give evidence to support its claims about, the earth being flat, or climate change not being a thing, or, vaccinations are bad, or Bill Gates is out to destroy the world? Whatever it is, doesn't matter. Is the site objective? Does it give evidence to support whatever claims or positions it's trying to present? Does it give both sides of the conversation equal time? Is the tone professional? Or is it one of these, I'm no expert, but have you noticed, but I think this? And if it's one of these sites where objectivity is completely gone out the window, be very careful. The information, which is clearly the reason why you're there. How complete is that information? How relevant? How factual? How topical is that information? What is it based on? And with that, go back to objectivity, right? Does the site give evidence to support its claims? Does it show both sides of the argument? And if it doesn't, there may be a reason for that, because at the very least, they're being unethical by not presenting both sides. And then also, if the site is maintained and has been maintained for a period of time, check the revision dates. Because if you go and search on the internet, you'll notice last updated, you can look at it and say, wow, it's just a week ago. That's pretty good. But last updated in, 2002, you might want to look at that information carefully. Now, is it of historical importance? Absolutely. I do a lot of historical research. In fact, I really enjoy doing it because I like to know what people were thinking at a certain time about something. To read about, what was Western Europe thinking about prior to the First World War? I mean, we are living in 2021 where we are unable to do that, right? Because we have a whole series of events that will color and cloud our perception of something that occurred prior to something else. Let's say the First World War, right? 1914, or the Second World War, 1939. What was happening between the wars? So the only way you can find out is to find and locate things that were published before that time, because they don't know. It's kind of simple, but it's a really interesting way to do historical research, if that's what you like to do. So if you find a source which has authors, it is objective, it's informational, but it was last updated in 2002, keep that in mind. And so you can point that out in a footnote. You can say, the site is not updated very often because it has to do with information that changes very, very slowly. But I would like to say that the nature of social media is very topical. And so if the information is topical, that means it gets updated regularly and often. So often as if, maybe every couple of weeks. So the revision date is important. But if you're looking for historical information, that revision date is slightly less important. If you want up-to-date information on, let's say, COVID vaccines or climate change, and something was last updated in 1996, that's more of historical importance. That certainly is not topical or relevant. So remind yourself of that. That revision date says a lot about the timeliness of that information. Okay, so that's pretty well it for this week. The first set of the first video lecture on interpersonal communications, and this one here, the second one on social media in the workplace. So both are very valid and important. Social media maybe not 100% on the task at hand that you are now in the middle of, which is writing your research report, but certainly this particular slide on authors, objectivity, information, and revision date, those four things are important in terms of your research. So that's pretty well it. Have a good week, and we will see you shortly. Bye-bye.